Joining me now is Lingxi Chenyang, an environmental law fellow at the Maurer School of Law on IU Bloomington's campus, specializing in environmental policy. Thank you for joining me today.
Good to be here, Tom. Thanks for inviting me.
I want to kind of talk about climate policy and where things are going with the new administration. We're almost done with President Biden's first 100 days. What has happened as far as climate policy in the first 100 days? A lot of focus has been on COVID, so it may have gone on the back burner, but has there been anything big as far as climate policy?
Well, there have been a number of items. So one of the first things that the Biden administration signed us back into was the Paris Climate Accord. So this was an international agreement. Almost 200 countries are in it. And the goal is to keep global temperature rise to below 2 degrees Celsius. And the US formally re-entered the international agreement in February after the previous administration withdrew last year. And this is a very popular move. About 75% of registered Americans support US participation in the Paris Climate Agreement. And the way that it works is that each country sets its own carbon reduction goal. So the Biden administration will set its pledge by Earth Day of this year. And this is very important because the US is perceived as a leader. So our goal will influence what other countries set. Another thing that the administration has done is to revoke the permit for the Keystone XL pipeline. So this pipeline was proposed in 2008. It's a 1,200-mile extension of an existing oil pipeline that runs from Canada through Montana, Nebraska, and South Dakota. And to build a pipeline, they needed a cross-border permit from the US. And the previous administration signed an executive order speeding up the approval process, I think around the fourth day of office. And then the Biden administration signed an executive order that revoked the permit during January of this year. And this is a very good move for climate. It'll help us avoid expensive oil spills and continue dependence on fossil fuels. Another thing is that oil mined from Canada's tar sands, which the pipeline would be bringing in, emits way more carbon than crude oil. It has an estimated similar impact as putting almost 40 million cars on the road. These spills are also very difficult to clean up. In 2010, there was a tar sand spill in the Kalamazoo River in Michigan, and that has costed us about $1 billion to clean up, and that's ongoing. Another thing that the Biden administration has done is to pass the Rescue Plan Act. So this was passed in March. It was a total of $1.9 trillion. And it had two things in there very good for the climate. One was a $30 billion item in assistance to mass transit systems that have suffered financially from the COVID crisis. So ridership on buses and trains really plummeted during COVID. And our buses and trains are so critical to lowering carbon emissions because public transportation saves way more emissions than passenger cars. And the second thing in the Rescue Plan Act was about $350 billion to states and cities to help prevent budget cuts that would otherwise harm air and water quality, reduce smog, tailpipe emissions, money for energy efficiency programs, money for sewage systems that can get overflow during floods. And this $350 billion is really important because states and cities are usually kind of strapped for cash, and these services and clean air, clean water are usually the first services to get cut. So I'll stop there.
That's good. Would you classify as anything up until this point as a big move, or is it just kind of setting the table or just kind of minor stuff?
Well, I think the revoking of the XL pipeline was quite a big move. We don't know how much oil was going to be brought in from that pipeline, but revoking the permit kind of just closes that door completely, and it kind of cuts our potential dependence on oil and gas from that pipeline. And the other things are kind of smaller moves. I think the Paris Climate Accord was a big move. Just for signaling that the US is sort of all in on climate change. And that could have potentially very large effects on the international sphere.
And now that, COVID has been top of mind up at this point, but we're finally starting to see other policies. And the big thing now that's being touted is the infrastructure plan. And there is a lot as far as climate policy in that plan. I'm not sure how you want to break this apart because there is a lot there, but it seems to uh, be encompassing everything, every little thought as far as if you're going to build a new road, if you're going to build a new hospital or something, climate's going to be top of mind in the plan.
Yeah, that's completely right. And there's a lot in this bill. There's a lot to get through. But I think the big take home point is that, okay, so there are three big kind of sources of emissions in the US. The biggest one is cars, that's at 28%, followed by electricity generation at 24%, and then industry at 22%. And the infrastructure bill targets each three of those big sources of emission. So included in the bill is $174 billion to transition from gas powered cars to EVs. And that includes consumer rebates to buy EV cars. And this is a very popular provision. About 82% of polled Americans support consumer rebates to buy more energy efficient cars. It includes grants to states and cities to build about 500,000 charging stations by 2030. And, I recently got an EV car, and it's a little bit difficult to make long trips without that infrastructure. So that's quite important to get all of us to transition to electric vehicles. And there's also a provision in there that electrifies the federal fleet of cars. So that includes things like USPS trucks, about 20% of school buses. And the government is already buying these vehicles. So transitioning that purchasing power to EVs is really important to get us to transition completely. The second provision in there is, all of these provisions on switching to clean energy. So one thing is the clean electricity standard that aims to achieve 100% clean power by 2035, and that includes nuclear and hydropower. There's about $100 billion in the plan to improve our power lines, which is really critical to bring all of the new additional clean electricity to consumers. Again, a very popular provision. About 84% of registered voters support improving our power lines and that infrastructure. There's another $16 billion in the plan to plug up abandoned oil and gas wells. And this is so important because those wells are just leaking methane into the atmosphere. And methane stays in the atmosphere for a shorter amount of time than carbon dioxide, but it's a much more potent greenhouse gas than carbon. And then the third thing is that there's $100 billion for improving infrastructure resilience. So, not only do we need to reduce our emissions, but we also have to prepare for kind of the inevitable effects of climate change. So hotter weather, floods, wildfires, and all that money is going to improve our highway system, protect hospitals from big flood events. There was a big one in, I think, about 2015 in Ohio that really flooded one of its major hospitals. So that money will be really, really important.
Before I circle back and get into probably more exacts on the infrastructure bill, is there any other policy you see that, all right, this infrastructure bill or plan passes, or maybe part of it passes? What's next? What are people going to have to look for? What's going to be the next debate or plan that might happen down the road?
Right. So what the infrastructure bill does is put a lot of money into the system to transition us to clean energy. But I think what we really need is a carbon tax across all sources. This is, as economists agree on, one of the most efficient ways to reduce our emissions very quickly. And the idea is that carbon taxes make carbon more expensive. And when prices of something goes up, then we want to buy less of it. And surprisingly, most Americans polled support about 67%, according to a 2020 poll done by Yale University. There's also a bipartisan carbon tax bill that was introduced in 2018. And I think the trick with a carbon tax is to get the price right. So the Biden administration in February pegged the cost of carbon at $51 a ton. And this is up from about $8 per ton under the previous administration. And that number was arrived at because we didn't account for the climate impacts outside of the US. And this number is really important. It's used to inform regulations. But the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, this kind of international panel of scientists, have said that carbon prices really need to start at $135 a ton and then keep on rising to keep global temperatures from exceeding 1.5 degrees Celsius. So, we still have a long way to go, but I think a carbon tax is really what's needed to reduce our emissions very quickly.
There have been a few countries that have experimented with carbon taxes. You have Canada. People are, anytime you say tax, people are going to like, whoa, 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 whoa. What is this money? What is the money collected from the tax designed to do? Is it just taken from me and then spent on anything, or is it going to be directed somehow?
Yeah, so that's a really good question. There are different ways to approach that question. So, one way is to use that money to fund clean energy investments. Another way to use that money is to give it back to consumers. Another way is to give it to, the most vulnerable communities who are at the front lines of climate change. Those who are living on the coastlines, who are living in the hottest parts of the city. So, the question of what we do with that money. It's a really important one. Um, so actually, California and the Northeast states already have not a carbon tax, but a cap and trade system. And some of their funding goes toward clean energy. Some of their money goes toward consumers. So we have experimented with, a carbon tax cap and trade sort of system in the country. And so we can look to those states to figure out what to do if we implement that program on a national level.
And it's a consumption tax. So, if people are rewarded for either not using it or the people who use it the most, that's where the cost goes, right?
Right, exactly. I think the idea is to tax the biggest polluters. So that means, utilities, car manufacturers, and those prices are going to be passed on to consumers eventually. But I think those entities will be the subject of the tax and not ordinary consumers.
And they may be motivated to make adjustments to obviously lessen their carbon use because then their profits would go up.
Yeah, exactly, exactly. And the hope is to spur innovation in some of these industries, particularly utilities, to find new ways of producing energy or producing cars without emitting so much carbon.
I want to circle back and maybe get into some details of the infrastructure plan, especially with EV. Um, I see some debate about this as like, well, the market will handle this, in the fact that a lot of car companies are saying we're going to go EV, but it seems to be there's some sort of chicken or the egg thing. Not that the market will make that change, but part of this is to make things happen more quickly. Is that why part of this is in the plan?
Yeah, that's exactly right. Um, you know, um, uh, Let me think about this question. I mean, if sort of if the market can help us
Let
switch
me
to
phrase that.
okay,
I'll rephrase it.
okay.
Um, Going to EVs, why this is such a big part of the infrastructure plan is if government were to do nothing, EVs would still probably come online. But are these attempts meant to speed up the transition?
Yeah, that's exactly right. I think it's very difficult for a car manufacturer to commit to EVs when there isn't a promise of that infrastructure. For consumers who have EVs to use, um, it's very difficult for one manufacturer to stick their neck out and transform their entire fleet to EVs, unless the government says we're putting so much money into the system that to incentivize everyone to switch.
There also seems to be a lot of an efficiency stuff inside of these things, whether it comes to new building standards or anything else. That a lot of that just kind of interwoven inside the bill. How important is that as far as becoming more? I guess this all falls under resiliency, not necessarily we're going to be more greener, but we're just going to be more resilient. How is that in the bill?
Right. So part of the bill says that we have to retrofit 2 million houses, commercial buildings, and public buildings to be energy efficient and climate resilient to floods. and other climate impacts. And energy efficiency is very important because it takes the energy that we are already using and maximizes its use basically. And some of these improvements are, I think, a lot cheaper than switching from a gas powered power plant to solar power or wind power. So it's a low hanging fruit compared to some of the other provisions. And the other part of retrofitting houses and other buildings is all of our buildings have to kind of be improved to deal with climate impacts. So hotter weathers, droughts, floods. So part of it is just dealing with the inevitable.
I think a lot you see the other side or the opposition to such a plan is, well, this costs so much, this costs so much, this costs so much. But some of this stuff was going to have to be was going to have to get done anyway. And we're just kind of adding on to, well, if you're going to build a road, it just now needs to be to this standard, and we need to build a hospital, or it has to be to this standard, and we're going to build cars, they need to be EV. Is the cost concerning, or is the cost a cost savings? If you invest now, is it something you're going to get back later?
It's definitely a cost savings. If we don't prepare for, what we're already experiencing, more intense floods, warmer weathers, then we'll have to pay we and our children will have to pay for it in the future. But the other thing is that, the infrastructure bill includes some important ways to pay for that one, the $2 trillion. So, one thing is that the corporate tax rate is increasing from 21% to 28%. Billions of subsidies and tax benefits that fossil fuel industry has already been receiving are going to be eliminated. There is going to be a strict new minimum tax on global profits that will be imposed, and there's going to be a crackdown on companies that try to move profits offshore. So built into the infrastructure bill are all of these ways of paying for that $2 trillion. But yeah, as you said, if we don't pay for this now, we're going to be paying a lot more in the future, both us and our children and our grandchildren. So this is really a cost savings bill.
Would you say everything that we're doing up to this, but we've rejoined the Paris Climate Accord, we now have this infrastructure bill, there may be more down the road. Does this take the US into a leader position in the world as far as climate policy, or are we still some sort of a follower or kind of dragging our feet?
I think this is a really good start. So, one example is that the Biden administration proposed to put 30 gigawatts of offshore wind on the coasts by 2030, and I think 100 gigawatts by 2050, before the infrastructure bill was put out. Now, this is a big step, but we really need to transition the entire energy sector. So we need to put 8 to 10 times that amount. So currently the investments they're a good step, but they need to be ramped up in the next 4 years in the administration.
As far as climate policy goes, and if you're just a casual person just living in the Midwest, um, you're going to see a lot of pushback, like, well, that's too much or that's not enough. Do you see this as finding is this plan? I think I'll ask it this way: is this plan extreme? You see like both sides saying, oh, this is too much or this isn't enough. Does that mean that this is maybe just right?
Yeah, I think it's a good start, but we still need to do more. I mean, in Midwest and in Indiana in particular, we're already experiencing hotter summer temperatures, droughts, floods. Farmers have been feeling the effects of spring floods that delay planting, lower crop yields. Cities are feeling heat waves. The city of Huntingburg experienced 300-year floods just in 18 months. So, we in Indiana are already dealing with the effects of climate change. And so, we need to act soon. I think some things that could be included either in an infrastructure bill or addressed during this administration is including the agricultural sector in climate efforts. And this is one of the most popular potential policies among polled Americans. to pay farmers to capture carbon in plants and soils. So, one thing we can do is to pay farmers to plant nut and fruit trees. Planting those on just 10% of US farmland would offset about a third of our country's emissions from fossil fuels, which is a very big number. And again, this is a very popular plan. About 86% of registered voters support federal funding to help farmers improve farming practices, and it's really needed. Yeah.
And I think you've kind of hit on this a couple of things. A lot of things, and I've looked at some of the same Yale studies that you're talking about, the same polling data or polls of similar people. When you just offer them solutions like, oh, how do you feel about solar power? How do you feel about wind power? How do you feel about electric vehicles? They're like, these are popular things, right? This is not just some sort of out of left field that, no one wants, right?
Yeah, exactly. I think some solutions are more popular than others. So, for a long time, the environmental movement did not include um, farmers and people working on working lands in their kind of vision for the future. And now there's kind of a focus on agriculture as the stage in which kind of um, our adaptation to climate change can be on. And so I think there are, finding those places where everyone can agree on is really, really important to get us moving on climate change.
And I think I'll wrap it up because it just sparked me on going towards green energy. Is this in the infrastructure plan or is it not? One of the biggest things is going to be, can we get off coal? There are still a lot of coal-fired power plants, especially in the state of Indiana, and the federal government doesn't always have that leverage to say, you got to shut those down. They can incentivize things and kind of make things more profitable or less profitable. Does anything that has been laid out yet get us into a greener solution now that we're going to see less coal-fired power plants and more alternative energy sources?
Yeah, this is a really important question for Indiana, which is still quite dependent on coal. So part of what's in the infrastructure bill is to demonstrate carbon capture retrofits for existing production facilities, mostly for steel, cement, and chemical production. But potentially there is a technology out there that captures carbon from coal power plants. But I think inevitably coal power plants have to be retired at some point. And I think all this money that funds clean electricity is going to help get us there. But without something like a carbon tax that makes coal generation unprofitable, it'll be very difficult to transition away from coal power.
So really what we're saying is you've said it a couple times, this is legitimately a first step. It may start bringing things into a competitive realm that the next step's going to have to be made to where, yeah, we can now rely upon solar and wind or EV because the infrastructure is there, that we don't need the old way.
Yeah, that's exactly right. It is that first step in the transition, and a first step that we have been waiting for a long time.
Yeah. Lingxi Chenyang, environmental fellow at the Maurer School of Law on IU Bloomington's campus. I really appreciate your interview and your time explaining the climate policy of right now.
Thank you so much, Tom, for inviting me and having me on.
Thank you.